Hello, my name is Howard Brayer. I am a Miami Beach resident and a volunteer for the Jewish Museum of Florida located in Miami Beach. I conduct walking tours for the museum, which provide an overview of the Jewish history of Miami Beach and a focus on select Jewish institutions and people who have played noteworthy roles in the life of Miami Beach. This presentation is based on the walking tour. Several decades ago, the residents of Miami Beach were primarily Jewish, and many of the people were immigrants from Eastern Europe. A nickname of the city was Shtetl by the Sea. Shtetl is the Yiddish word for the small villages where many Jewish people lived in Eastern Europe. Yiddish was their native tongue. Therefore, the name of the presentation, Miami Beach, Shtetl by the Sea. A key year in the entire Miami area was 1896. That's when the railroad first reached the city of Miami. Except Miami was not a city, it was only a little village of a few hundred people, and there was no urban settlement at all in what was to become Miami Beach. The coming of the railroad is what started the growth in the whole area. Back in the 19th and early 20th century, wherever the railroad went in the country, often Jewish people would settle. At the time, a lot of Jewish people were traders and peddlers and small business owners, and they would set up shop in the new railroad towns. And Miami was no exception to that. Of the first 16 businesses that opened in Miami after the railroad came, 12 were Jewish owned. Isidore Cohn was one of those business owners and was the first permanent Jewish resident of Miami. Typically, he opened a dry goods store. Miami Beach developed somewhat later, starting slowly in the 1910s, picking up pace in the 20s, and the population really exploded in the 1930s. The first Jewish residents of Miami Beach were Joe and Jenny Weiss. They were Hungarian immigrants who first lived in New York and moved to Miami Beach in 1913. They opened a business which still exists to this day, one that many of you may have heard of, Joe's Stone Crab Restaurant, which is Miami Beach's oldest and probably best known restaurant. Many famous people have eaten there over the years. Some of the old-timers include the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Will Rogers, J. Edgar Hoover, and Al Capone, who had a vacation home in Miami Beach. I have a comparison of prices from 1963 until today, 2020. Chowder was 50 cents, today $9.95. Stone crabs were $3.25, today $56.95, and ice cream was 40 cents, today $7.95. So the total cost of that meal back in 1963 was $4.15, today $74.85. In the early days of Miami Beach in the 1910s and early 1920s, most of the land of the city was owned by three different real estate companies. One was Alton Beach Realty, headed by the key developer in Miami Beach history, Carl Fisher. A second was the Miami Beach Improvement Company, headed by John Collins, who turned in the 1910s from farming to real estate development. For the most part, both of these companies didn't sell plots of land to Jewish people because of anti-Semitism. Only the third company, Ocean Beach Realty, sold to Jewish people. It was headed by two brothers, J. E. Lummis, pictured here, and J. N. Lummis. They owned the land south of 5th Street near the southern tip of Miami Beach. So in the city's early years, the still small Jewish population was concentrated in that area. By the way, J. N. Lummis was the first mayor of Miami Beach beginning in 1915. There were also other forms of discrimination against Jewish people, especially in the city's early years. Some hotels didn't allow Jewish guests. Some clubs didn't allow Jewish members. On the left is a real estate ad that says in part, "Those that want the best things out of life buy houses and plots in our restricted developments." Restricted meant no Jewish or black people. On the right is a hotel ad that says catering to a Gentile clientele. But I think it's equally important to note that even though there was some discrimination against Jewish people both in Miami and Miami Beach, both cities were more open to Jewish development and settlement than many other new resorts and towns that were popping up in the southern part of the country early in the 20th century. By the mid-1920s, there were about 25 Jewish families in Miami Beach, so you can see we're still talking small numbers. The first congregation was formed in the city in 1927, Beth Jacob, which means House of Jacob. It was an Orthodox congregation, the most observant branch of Judaism. For 2 years, the congregation met in various buildings in the southern end of the city. The first high holiday services that year were held at the Sea Breeze Hotel at 4th Street and Collins Avenue. Neither the building nor the hotel still exist. Then in 1929, the congregation erected this building, the first long-term synagogue on Miami Beach at 3rd Street and Washington Avenue. Today it's part of the Jewish Museum of Florida. In the 1930s, Jewish people started to get more influence in the city, moving into professional positions, becoming hotel developers and owners, and opening many retail establishments. By 1940, Miami Beach was about 20% Jewish, quite a high figure. The Jewish population in the country at the time was only 3%. Miami Beach elected its first Jewish city councilman in 1934. His name was Baron de Hirschmeyer. It elected the first of its 17 Jewish mayors in 1943. His name was Mitchell Wolfson. Pictured here is Washington Avenue, which became the main shopping street in South Beach. To give you a feel for that era, some of the businesses located in the area included Thaler Brothers Bakery, Reisman's Delicatessen, Gutman and Beta Kosher Meats, Sunshine Kosher Market, Stone's Market, Alfred Eisman Bathing Suits, Hoberger's Photo Shop, and S.J. Friedman Jewish Bookstore. During World War II, which for America began in 1941, Miami Beach became a large Army training facility for the Army Air Corps. There was no separate Air Force at the time. About 500,000 troops passed through the city. There is no actual Army base. The troops were housed in the city's hotels and apartment buildings and used the city's streets, golf courses, polo fields, and beach to train on. The Air Corps had an outsized number of Jewish soldiers. Pictured here is a Passover Seder held for the troops at Congregation Beth Jacob. After the war, there was a large increase in the population in the Miami area. The increase was driven by what's called the 3 A's. The first A was the Army. Of course, many of the troops enjoyed their time here. They might have been here in midwinter when it was 75 degrees in Miami Beach. Back home in New York or Chicago, it might have been 25 degrees. So after the war, many of the troops returned with their families, either as vacationers or working residents or eventually as retirees. The second A was airplanes. Airplane travel became much more widespread after the war, bringing all of Florida much closer to the rest of the country. The third A, I think, was the most important, air conditioning. It was a rarity before the war, but became much more common afterwards and opened up the entire southern portion of the country to increased development. Miami Beach shared in the general increase in population. In Miami Beach, the increase was comprised primarily of Jewish people. By 1950, Miami Beach was about 50% Jewish. The peak of the Jewish population was in the 1960s and 70s. In that era, Miami Beach as a whole was about 60% Jewish, South Beach about 80%. People were primarily from large northern cities, especially New York. Also mixed in were Holocaust survivors and after 1959, some of the 15,000 to 20,000 Jews who fled Cuba when Castro took over. There was much less discrimination after the war. In 1949, Miami Beach enacted a law that banned signs indicating discriminatory practices based on race or religion. A business could still discriminate, but it just couldn't advertise that it was doing so. It doesn't seem like much now, but at the time it was seen as a major advancement. The federal civil rights legislation of 1964 ended most forms of discrimination based on religion. You might ask, why did Miami Beach and Miami become so heavily Jewish? Here are several thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1930s, Jewish people started owning hotels in Miami Beach. As you would expect, they encouraged Jewish people to be their guests, but they also actively encouraged Jewish people to move to Miami Beach and reside permanently. Next, Jewish institutions such as synagogues and Jewish cemeteries already existed in the Miami area before World War II, and there was access to kosher food. So when the larger numbers came after the war, if they were looking for these sorts of Jewish amenities, they would go to where it already existed. Also, and this pertains primarily to the immediate post-war years, many of the people coming from the north still lived in heavily Jewish neighborhoods and may have felt more comfortable around other Jews. So in that sense, there was a snowball effect. Finally, many of the elderly who were settling in Florida, and elderly Jews in particular, were moving from inner cities, had never driven, and were unlikely to start. Miami and Miami Beach were two of the rare areas in Florida where one could live comfortably without a car. There was a thriving Yiddish-speaking community in Miami Beach after the war. Many of the people who came here were immigrants from Eastern Europe from early in the 20th century, and Yiddish was their native tongue. There was Yiddish theater, singing groups, political groups, radio programming, and access to multiple Yiddish language newspapers. Pictured here is a Yiddish theater at 12th Street and Washington Avenue. It later became the Mansion nightclub. Tourism took off in the late 1940s and boomed in the 1950s and 60s with America's post-war prosperity. The number of visitors to Miami Beach rose from 50,000 in 1935 to 2 million in 1955. Miami Beach clubs and hotels drew the country's top entertainers of the time, including Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Jackie Gleason, Milton Berle, The Supremes, and Jerry Lewis. A significant portion of all visitors to Miami Beach in this period were Jewish. The era was epitomized by the Fontainebleau Hotel, pictured here, which opened in 1954 and was and still is Miami Beach's largest hotel. It had a Jewish owner, Ben Novak, and a Jewish architect, Morris Lapidus. Miami Beach became one of the two main resorts for Jewish people in the country, the other being the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. Of course, Miami Beach in the winter, the Catskills in the summer. Ironically, the Pan Coast Hotel in Miami Beach, which earlier advertised itself as being carefully restricted, was taken over by the Grossinger family, owner of the famed Grossinger Hotel in the Catskills, and became the Grossinger Pan Coast. This is a page from the New York Post newspaper in the 1940s featuring advertisements for Miami Beach and Catskills hotels. It includes ads for the Kent, Netherlands, and Cardozo hotels in Miami Beach and the Nevele, Laurels, and Flagler hotels in the Catskills. We can divide Miami Beach into two parts in the post-war era. One is South Beach, which will be featured in the next slide, but first the neighborhoods of Mid Beach and North Beach, which will be talked about together. These latter two neighborhoods were where almost all the new development in Miami Beach after 1950 took place, and the residents who lived here were largely middle and upper class. They were drawn by the new building's air conditioning and swimming pools, plus expanding shopping opportunities in the area. Pictured is a stretch of Collins Avenue in Mid Beach, referred to as Condo Canyon, because large condominiums replaced a number of single-family mansions erected in this stretch before the war. The area had been known as Millionaires Row. South Beach was almost fully developed before the war, and its buildings lacked the modern amenities of the newer buildings to the north. So through the 1950s and early 60s, South Beach fell out of favor. By the late 60s, it was receiving few visitors. And in addition to being heavily Jewish, the population in South Beach had two other main characteristics. One, it was low income. South Beach became a very, very inexpensive area to live in. And two, it was elderly. In 1980, the median age was 66. Next are a couple of typical South Beach street scenes from the 1970s. On the left is a popular fruit stand, Big Chips. Note that the movie theater next door is featuring a festival of sex. On the right are people waiting for the bus. Next is what I think is the iconic scene of South Beach in that era, the elderly residents sitting on the front porch of their building. And keeping in mind the demographics of South Beach in that era, I have a poem to recite. This poem was written by a Jewish Miami Beach resident named Irving Zeman in 1954, and it's called Lower Costs. The South Beach tans are deeper than what they are uptown. The prices here are cheaper as you move further down, so you can well stay longer and save your pennies too, while your shades of tan grow stronger and sand gets in each shoe. At 3rd Street is an outpost of Fair Lummis Park, where by day they roast and by night they spark. Octogenarians, young once more, as they were some decades of years before. Although true passion may have been spent, they still need someone to help pay the rent. Matchmakers are busy, though not always paid, but getting some pleasure from matches they've made. Yiddish is the language, as used in many lands. Informal conversation each soon understands. The jokester tells stories with gesticulations, and old folks enjoy his insinuations. Like youngsters they laugh and forget they are gray, hearing the puns of a bygone day. By the mid-1970s, developers got an interest in South Beach and wanted to knock down the old buildings and put up new ones. That's when the preservation movement began to save the old buildings. The preservation movement was initially led by a Jewish woman, Barbara Capitman. She was a designer from New York who moved to the Miami area in 1973. She founded the Miami Design Preservation League in 1976. For the most part, the preservation movement was successful, and many of the older buildings were saved. Starting just after the preservation movement began, slowly in the early 1980s, picking up steam in the late 80s and 1990s, there was a big economic revitalization in South Beach. It was very successful, so now once again, all of Miami Beach, including the South Beach neighborhood, is a highly desirable place to live or to visit. One of the key players in the economic revitalization was a Jewish businessman, a developer named Tony Goldman. He was also originally from New York and first visited the Miami area in the mid-1980s. He eventually purchased and renovated a total of 18 hotels in Miami Beach. 18 was no accident. It's the numerical value of the Hebrew word chai, which means life. He later had a hand in the redevelopment of the Wynwood neighborhood in Midtown Miami. While all that was going on, there was a tremendous change in the population of Miami Beach. Today, the city is about 15% Jewish, high by national standards, but low by Miami Beach historic standards. On average, the population is much wealthier, as it's an expensive place to live rather than an inexpensive place, and much younger. The median age here now is 39, quite a difference from the 66 of just a few decades ago. Two things happened to the people that were living here. One, by the 1980s and 90s, they were passing away in large numbers due to their age. Two, as this became an expensive neighborhood, many of the people couldn't afford to live here any longer and had to move away. In the late 70s and early 80s, the city of Miami Beach did build some subsidized housing for the elderly residents, but not enough to cover most of the people. There's still an active Jewish community in Miami Beach with about 10 synagogues, a dozen kosher restaurants, the Jewish Community Center, pictured here, the Holocaust Memorial, and the Jewish Museum of Florida. Now moving into the second part of the presentation, a look at noteworthy Jewish people and institutions in Miami Beach history that don't fit into a neat timeline. First, a look at several congregations and their influential rabbis. In the very late 1930s and early 1940s, a group of people broke away from Congregation Beth Jacob and formed what eventually became the Miami Beach Jewish Center, the first conservative congregation in Miami Beach. In 1948, its current synagogue, pictured here, was completed. It's modeled on the Great Synagogue in Algiers, Algeria, with Byzantine and Moorish details. The main sanctuary sat approximately 1,400 people. In 1954, its name was changed to Temple Emmanuel, which means "May God be with us." At its peak in the 1970s, membership grew to 1,300 families. High holiday services attracted up to 4,000 participants, and services were held at the nearby Miami Beach Convention Center to handle the overflow. Membership is now much less, reflecting the decrease of the Jewish population of Miami Beach. In 1943, Irving Lerman became the rabbi and was the rabbi for the next 50 years. Over time, he became an influential leader in both the Jewish and wider community. President Johnson appointed him to the White House Task Force on Food, Nutrition, and Health and to the White House Conference on Aging. He was an active supporter of Israel and a national and international spokesman for Judaism and Jewish causes. Rabbi Lerman served as president of the Synagogue Council of America, chairman of the Rabbinic Council for the United Jewish Appeal, and on many boards of Jewish and interfaith organizations. Through the years, he received numerous awards and citations for his achievements. Next is Temple Beth Shalom, the largest and oldest Reform synagogue in Miami Beach, founded in 1942. Its spiritual leader from 1944 until 1984 was Rabbi Leon Kronish, a leader of Reform Judaism in America. He was actively involved in both the Zionist movement and the American Civil Rights Movement. You probably recognize this building from earlier in the presentation, Beth Jacob Synagogue. Pictured here is Rabbi Moses Meshaloff, who led Beth Jacob from 1937 until 1954. He was an Orthodox rabbi and community leader for 75 years. He was president of the Dade County Rabbinical Association and vice president of the Rabbinical Council of America. He also designed the beautiful stained glass windows that adorn Beth Jacob, which were installed in 1940. Pictured here is Congregation Bet Shmuel, also known as the Cuban Hebrew Congregation. It was founded in 1961 by several of the estimated 10,000 to 15,000 Cuban Jews who left Cuba and settled in South Florida after the 1959 revolution. The original name was the Cuban Hebrew Circle of Miami. It was an Orthodox congregation. In its early years, the congregation met at several sites in South Beach. A small synagogue was opened in 1975 at its present site on Michigan Avenue. A larger and its current building was opened in 1984 and became a conservative congregation. The stained glass windows in front of the building depict the 12 tribes of Israel. Rabbi Alexander Gross founded the Hebrew Academy in 1947 as the first Orthodox Jewish day school south of Baltimore. Today it serves approximately 600 students from preschool through grade 12. Opened in 1974, the Talmudic University provides classes, lectures, and study groups to community members of all ages and levels of Jewish affiliation. We're now moving on to a favorite topic of many, food. Norman Kaplan was born in Minsk, in what's now Belarusia, and emigrated to the United States when he was 13. In 1944, he settled in North Miami Beach from Long Island and was one of the first early kosher butchers in Miami Beach. He owned and operated Kaplan's Kosher Food Market on 6th Street and Washington Avenue until 1971. He was very involved with the founding of Temple Beit Tefillah in Miami Beach and served as its first president. He also served as president of the United Kosher Association of Greater Miami. Saul Kallenberg was born in Austria in 1901 and settled in the United States in New York City in 1922. He had a butcher shop in the Bronx, but after being robbed twice, he decided to relocate to Miami Beach for better opportunities. He operated the butcher shop at 618 Collins Avenue from 1950 until 1969. Bernstein's Jewish Home Cooking was the first Miami Beach restaurant to serve typical Eastern European Jewish food. It operated from 1927 until 1938 and was located on Ocean Drive and Biscayne Street. Pictured here is a very popular kosher restaurant, The Famous. It was opened in 1945 by a Polish immigrant named Max Lerner. It was located on Washington Avenue between 6th and 7th Streets. When patrons sat down before they ordered anything, they were given coleslaw, pickles, sauerkraut, several kinds of bread, and a bottle of seltzer. If requested, chocolate syrup was also offered. The menu included such Eastern European staples as matzo ball soup, stuffed kishka, which is beef intestines stuffed with a mixture of flour or matzah meal, chicken fat, and spices. Tastes much better than it sounds. Also boiled beef flanken and brisket of beef. In the late 1970s, the restaurant placed an ad in the newspaper asking its shrinking clientele to please come back, stating that portions were now smaller. Evidently, the ad did not work, at least not well enough, as The Famous closed just after that in 1981 due to changing neighborhood demographics and a general change in diet to lighter food. Of course, Miami Beach had its fair share of Jewish delicatessens. Pictured here are three of the most popular, all opened by Wolfie Kohn. Probably the most popular was Wolfie's, a classic old-time Jewish deli with two locations at Collins Avenue and Lincoln Road and at Collins Avenue and 21st Street. The restaurants became known for their baskets of assorted varieties of miniature rolls and danishes and stainless steel buckets of pickles, sauerkraut, and other vegetables that were all served at no additional cost with meals. Also here is Pumpernicks, which was located at Collins Avenue and 67th Street. A third deli, Rascal House, was actually in Sunny Isles at Collins Avenue and 172nd Street. It opened in 1954 and closed in 2008. The restaurant featured a sign that said, "The only thing that needs to come dressed is our chickens," meaning that dining was casual, not clothing optional. Cafeterias were also very popular. In 1947, Morris Himmelstein, who operated 6 Concord cafeterias in New York City, followed his customers and opened an outlet at 1921 Collins Avenue in Miami Beach. It was the last of the cafeterias to close in 1983. Hoffman's Cafeteria opened in 1940 in a classic Art Deco building. Later, it became the Warsaw Ballroom, a popular gay club, and Jerry's Famous Deli. It's now a Senor Frog's. Moving on to architects, two of the most prominent architects who worked in Miami Beach were Jewish. First, we have Henry Hohauser, pictured here with his wife Grace. He was one of the two leading Art Deco architects who worked in the city. Here is his 1936 Congress Hotel. He also designed the Cardozo, Colony, and Park Central hotels. He was ranked as one of the most 100 influential people in South Florida history by the Miami Herald. The second architect we have here is Morris Lapidus. He was a Jewish Ukrainian immigrant based in New York. He designed over 1,000 buildings during a career spanning more than 50 years. He was a leading mid-century modern architect who worked in Miami Beach. Here's his addition to Temple Menorah on 75th Street, giving it a cheese grater look. He also designed the Fontainebleau and Eden Rock hotels and turned Lincoln Road into a pedestrian mall in 1960. Miami Beach is noted for its colorful buildings. When the older Art Deco buildings were first erected, they were painted primarily neutral colors. That change is largely due to the efforts of one man, a designer, Leonard Horowitz, who was heavily involved in the early days of the preservation movement in Miami Beach. He had the idea that if the buildings were painted multiple colors and the architectural details highlighted, more people would appreciate the buildings and thus help the preservation movement. In the 1980s, he oversaw the painting of many buildings. He used a specific color palette pictured here. The very first building that Horowitz oversaw the painting of was Friedman's Kosher Bakery at 7th Street and Washington Avenue. We can see the before, all white, and the after with a great pop of colors. Moving on to hotels, we have the Nemo Hotel, which was the first of many kosher hotels in Miami Beach. A kosher hotel means it serves kosher food to its guests. It was located at 1st Street and Collins Avenue and opened in 1922. The building now is the home of the Prime Fish restaurant owned by the Jewish businessman Miles Shefitz. Also pictured here is the Alamac Hotel, another kosher hotel which opened in 1934 on Collins Avenue at 13th Street. It was owned by the Jacobs family, who also owned several kosher hotels in New York and New Jersey. The picture here is a meeting of the Young Men's Hebrew Association in 1938. Today there are no more kosher hotels remaining in Miami Beach. The last full-time kosher resort was the Saxony Hotel, which closed in 2005. Pictured here are two more hotels that had a heavily Jewish clientele in the mid-decades of the 20th century. First, the Eden Rock, which opened in 1955. It was a great rival to its neighbor, the Fontainebleau, which had opened a year earlier in 1954. Next is the Colonial Inn, which was located in what was called Motel Row in Sunny Isles. It was a 30-block stretch of motels catering to a middle-class clientele in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The larger hotels further south, such as the Eden Rock, drew in more upscale guests. I've picked the Colonial Inn to display because in the 1960s and early 1970s, my family would spend many Passovers at the Colonial Inn driving down from New Jersey. From the mid-1930s until 1950, illegal gambling thrived in Miami Beach hotels. Much of it was the illegal bets placed on horse racing through bookies working at the hotels. At its peak in the late 1940s, up to 200 Miami Beach hotels featured gambling. There's an anecdote that in the late 40s, one could walk up and down Collins Avenue and continuously hear racing results from radios playing in hotels along the way. In 1944, the S&G Gambling Syndicate, established by 5 Jewish bookmakers, was formed. The syndicate eventually controlled the gambling operations in many of the hotels. In 1948, the syndicate grossed over $26 million in bets, quite a sum for those days. No one knows for sure what the initials S&G stood for, but it may have been for stop and go. Miami Beach government officials were lax in cracking down on the illegal gambling, since it brought a lot of money into the city. When there was any sort of government law enforcement, the bookies had to temporarily stop operations. When the government looked the other way, operations could go on. Melvin Richard was one of the first Jewish lawyers to practice in Miami Beach. He was eventually a Miami Beach municipal judge, councilman, and mayor. While a councilman in the late 1940s, he focused on ending the illegal gambling. He played a large part in persuading the U.S. Senate Crime Investigating Committee, headed by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, to come to Miami and hold hearings on the operations of the S&G. These hearings led to the downfall of the syndicate and put an end to much, though not all, of the illegal gambling in Miami Beach. Rose Weiss, along with her husband Jeremiah and their children, were the second Jewish family to reside in Miami Beach. They moved to Miami Beach from New York in 1919. On the left, she is standing in front of their residence at 221 Collins Avenue. Rose came to be known as the mother of Miami Beach. Among other things, she designed the official flag of the city in 1950, pictured here. She attended every city council meeting over a period of 38 years. She coined the official motto of the city, which is no longer in use, "Forward with Caution," which, by the way, is right up my alley. She was the volunteer head of the city's welfare department before it was a paid position, and during World War II, she raised more funds selling war bonds than any other woman in the state of Florida. Turning to sports, Miami Beach's well-known Fifth Street boxing gym was opened in 1950 by two brothers, Chris and Angelo Dundee. You might recognize the name Angelo Dundee. He was a famous boxing trainer whose most famous trainee was Muhammad Ali. Ali did much of his training at the Fifth Street Gym and won the heavyweight championship for his first time in Miami Beach. He defeated Sonny Liston in February 1964. While he was training for the fight early in '64, the Beatles were on their first trip to America. They visited only 3 cities, New York, Washington, D.C., and Miami Beach. While in Miami Beach, they made a visit to the gym, pictured here. So far, I've mentioned 7 people in connection with the gym: the 2 Dundees, the 4 Beatles, and Ali. None of them were or are Jewish. However, there is a Jewish connection to the gym: Benjamin Evil Eye Finkel. He moved to Miami Beach in 1938 and lived in the city until he passed away in 1978. He had 2 careers, both based out of the Fifth Street Gym. His first career was as a boxer, but he only had a few fights. His boxing career did not amount to anything. He's more noted for his second career. And it was said that what Babe Ruth was to baseball, Caruso was to opera, and Charlie Chaplin was to the movies, Evil Eye Finkel was to the hex. For a total of $50 to $300 per fight, Evil Eye would be hired by a boxer to put a hex, or a spell, on his opponent. He also used his powers for baseball games and horse racing. There was a big article in Sports Illustrated magazine about Evil Eye in the early 1970s. Sports Illustrated called him a boxing legend, a rascal who mixed 2 parts voodoo with 1 part fraud and lurched through life unburdened by honest labor. Stanley "Skip" Burtman grew up in Miami Beach. His father was a maitre d' at Wolfie's, and his mother owned a women's clothing store on Lincoln Road. Skip played football and baseball for Miami Beach High in the 1950s. He was the Miami Beach High School baseball head coach from 1965 to 1975. His teams won a state championship and were runner-up twice. He was also the head baseball coach at Louisiana State University from 1984 until 2001. His teams won 5 college baseball championships, and he was named College Baseball Coach of the Year 5 times. I mentioned earlier that a substantial number of Holocaust survivors settled in the Miami area. The Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach was conceived in 1984 by a committee of Holocaust survivors as a memorial to the memory of the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust. It opened to the public in February 1990 with Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel as the guest speaker at the dedication ceremonies. The memorial was designed by Kenneth Treaster. The centerpiece of the memorial is the sculpture of Love and Anguish, an outstretched arm tattooed with the number from Auschwitz rising from the earth, the last reach of a dying person. Each visitor will have their own interpretation. Some see despair, some see hope, some see the last grasp for life. To conclude the presentation, a look at 4 Miami Beach cultural organizations founded by Jews. John and Joanna Bass were Jewish immigrants from Vienna, Austria, who resided in Miami Beach. As president of the Fajardo Sugar Company of Puerto Rico, John Bass was also an amateur journalist, artist, and composer of published music. He collected both fine art and cultural artifacts. In 1963, the couple donated a collection of more than 500 works, including old master paintings, textiles, and sculptures, to the city of Miami Beach, under the agreement that a Bass Museum of Art would remain open to the public in perpetuity. John Bass directed the museum from its founding in 1964 until his death in 1978. The Bass now focuses on temporary exhibitions of international contemporary art. In addition, a selection of works from the original Bass collection are displayed. In 1987, Michael Tilson Thomas founded the New World Symphony in Miami Beach, an orchestral academy for gifted young musicians whose mission is to prepare highly gifted graduates of distinguished music programs for leadership roles in orchestras and ensembles around the world. He is the Academy's artistic director. He's the grandson of the noted Yiddish theater actors Boris and Bessie Tomaszewski. He leads the Tomaszewski Project, which is designed to rescue, communicate, and preserve the story of the Tomaszewskis and the contribution of the early American Yiddish theater to American cultural life. The Wilsonian Museum was opened in 1995 to exhibit, document, and preserve the Mitchell Wolfson Jr. collection of decorative and propaganda arts, a vast collection of objects that includes furniture, paintings, books, prints, and industrial and decorative art objects. The collection focuses on the years 1850 to 1950. Mitchell Wolfson Jr. was born and raised in Miami Beach and is the son of the first Jewish mayor of the city, Mitchell Wolfson. In 1997, it became a division of Florida International University when Wolfson donated his collection and museum facility to the university, the largest gift ever contributed to a public university in Florida. The Jewish Museum of Florida-FIU is housed in what was Beth Jacobs Synagogue. The museum's permanent exhibit, Mosaic, Jewish Life in Florida, 1763 to present, began as a traveling exhibit in 1990. The museum opened in 1995. If this presentation has whet your appetite, you may be interested in a walking tour sponsored by the museum, which will provide you with a more in-depth look at Miami Beach Jewish history. That brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.